joining us today from Glasgow. We're here today to discuss recorded police warnings and fixed penalty notices for antisocial behaviour. And these are commonly known as direct measures, and that's how we'll probably describe them through this morning. This is a roundtable jointly hosted by the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland. I'm very grateful for everybody who's been organising this and our speakers. Last year I committed to this event with the objective of providing insight into the use of direct measures by police service in Scotland and in the criminal justice sector more generally. Our initial plans were delayed to allow the publication of the Lord Advocate's guidelines on direct measures, and that happened in September 2024, just this September, and we'll hear more about those guidelines as we go on. Direct measures generally were introduced in January 2016, replacing the formal adult warning scheme. And the use of recorded police warnings and fixed penalty apply to those 18 or over, where the principles of the Lord Advocate's guidelines are met. And Scotland's National Strategy for Community Justice includes an aim to optimise the use of diversion generally and intervention at the earliest opportunity in offending. By way of further general background, a joint inspection agency review of diversion from prosecution was published in February 2023, and it can be found on the HMICS website. And they concluded generally diversion is working well and is developing in a positive direction, but you can make up your minds as you watch this webinar. That inspection made 34 recommendations. However, a critical issue from that review was the low level of confidence in the use of generally and diversion for adults, and maybe we can address that point through this webinar. We are delighted to welcome a series of keynote speakers to provide their insight and expertise on this topic of direct measures. And this event will be an opportunity to hear about the legal and practical aspects of how police warnings are used, documented in the Scottish criminal justice system. Our speakers will share their knowledge of the policies and procedures governing the use of these direct measures, the implications on the records of individuals' legal rights, and the role they play in society, criminal investigations, and proceedings by the Crown. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves as they come to speak, and I'm going to start off by asking ACC Wendy Middleton to lead us through the details of how Police Scotland view, use and record direct measures. Wendy, to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, and good morning to everybody online. And thank you, Chair, to yourself and the Scottish Police Authority for arranging today's meeting. I'm very keen to engage on this topic, and I look forward to hearing the other panel members. I'm accompanied by Chief Superintendent Pat Campbell, the Divisional Commander for Criminal Justice, and I'm the Assistant Chief Constable for Criminal Justice Division. As the Chair has already mentioned, these are not new guidelines. They were originally launched in 2016, police enabling us to address specified offences where it is justifiable and proportionate. The guidance permits officers in appropriate circumstances to resolve offending behaviour at or near the time of the offence and in a proportionate manner. So direct measures take two forms in this context: recorded police warnings, and they ensure that the offence is recorded, that victims can see justice delivered at the earliest opportunity, people are prevented from entering the criminal justice system unnecessarily, and they allow those used for less serious crime who meets the criteria in the guidelines. A separate framework exists for 16 to 18-year-olds, and for young people the focus and priority will always be on early and effective intervention. A list of offences is contained within the guidelines. I'll not go through them today in the spirit of keeping to my time limit, but examples include minor assault, breach of the peace, wasting police times, and offences that are separately referenced in the Antisocial Behaviour Act. Officers should take into account the views of the victim if known or affected, and of course sometimes crimes will not have a specific victim, and any community impact. Where a child is involved, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child should be considered, including their best interests and or their views depending upon the individual circumstances. In terms of the offender's criminal history should be taken into account, and if this is a pattern of conduct or behaviour, then a direct measure may not be appropriate. The causes of repeat offending may be able to be addressed through a diversionary method following report to the Crown Office, or of course through prosecution if that is considered appropriate. There is no requirement to have an admission of guilt from the offender, and if they refuse to accept a direct measure, then a prosecution report can be prepared as normal. Recorded police warnings can be issued retrospectively following further inquiries being conducted, and we have up to 28 days in which to issue a recorded police warning. Antisocial behaviour fixed penalty notices can only be issued at the time. It is entirely probable that there will always be more recorded police warnings issued than fixed penalty notices due to the limited number of offences contained within the antisocial behaviour legislation that would be worthy of consideration of a fixed penalty notice. I think it's really important, Chair, to state that direct measures are not appropriate in cases of sexual crime, hate crime, or incidents of domestic abuse. They cannot be issued when the injury is more than superficial or the conduct is persistent or alarming, to name but a few, and they are not appropriate in cases of serious crime. Direct measures can still be issued within the 28 days of the offence by police or at any time by the Crown Office. Cases can still proceed to court, but these are summary offences, which would potentially result in a fine or admonishment if they had gone through the court system. This facility allows Police Scotland to make decisions at the time, meaning that the case is not protracted. In terms of our training, national guidance has been published and a bespoke training package has been developed for student officers, and an updated product for officers within division advising of the changes, and as I say, importantly, when it is not appropriate to issue a direct measure. My thanks to Chief Inspector Kirk Donnelly, who's joined me today, for all of the support that he has provided in regards to this. There have previously been concerns about the inappropriate use of direct measures and press headlines that Police Scotland may not have adhered to the guidance. To maintain public trust and confidence, it is very important that Police Scotland use the decision-making ability that we have been given wisely. We are, however, now better supported by technology and national systems, which we have been able to lock down insofar as is possible to prevent any erroneous errors. This is not foolproof, but it is much better than we have had before. The process has been automated for officers on their mobile devices. Once they upload the offender's details, then an automatic crime record is populated, and this is subject to strict internal assurance to ensure compliance with the Scottish crime reporting standards, as is the case with all crimes reported to Police Scotland. There's also a weekly and a monthly audit conducted, and I'm content that any issues that we have discovered have been rectified. An annual report will be provided to the Lord Advocate from the Chief Constable to ensure transparency in our processes. I am grateful for the external scrutiny of our use, and I welcome challenge in this space as we continue to improve the service that we offer. A review of Police Scotland adoption and implementation of the guidelines will be conducted with Crown Office colleagues later this month. In summary, the use of direct measures is an incremental and proportionate approach to addressing less serious crime at the closest point to the commission of the offence. A similar outcome would in all likelihood be the case if it proceeds throughout the system. Whilst very mindful of victim impact and understanding that what is considered less serious crime in policing terms can have a significant adverse impact on those who have experienced it, the appropriate use of a direct measure means that there is justice for the victim and they can move forward without the worry associated with further elongation of the process or court appearances. Direct measures does not, however, sit alone and is part of wider justice transformation across Scotland to better support victims by providing justice at the earliest opportunity and ensuring that those cases that should proceed to court do so without undue delay. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Wendy. Now, we've got a little bit of time. I'm just going to ask you two questions, and if you can't answer them directly, maybe we can bring it back at the end. Firstly, you said about victim views are taken into account. Can you just elaborate a little bit about what that means in practice?
Thank you, Chair. So I think it's really important when we're considering a direct measure, if there is a victim identified and present, that their views are taken into account as to what justice means for them. And justice will mean something differently for different people. Now, this does not mean necessarily that we would then take into account their views and proceed on that basis. We do have to balance this with proportionality and also then in terms of the pressures within the criminal justice system that we know we have already. However, their views are important, they do need to be listened to, and I would like to think that we can reach a balance that achieves the objectives for everybody.
My second question, and we're going to come back to questions to everybody on the panel at the end. Please feel free to think about that. I just need to know the volume. What numbers are we talking about of these? I know the most recent guidelines probably don't have enough time, but kind of roughly what we're talking about in a year for these two sets of direct measures.
So in terms of the figures, we did actually collate some figures in preparation for today. And from the new guidance has been issued, which I think is probably the appropriate benchmark to take, we have issued 7,931 direct measures since September. In terms of what that equates to about 6% of total crime reported in that time period. And I would expect that figure to be about right in terms of the percentage that we can take out of the system and deal with by way of direct measures in its totality.
One final one then. It's in the continuum of the discretion that every police officer is required to exercise. There's doing nothing, there's kind of saying, well, that's not a very bright thing to do, and then it's moving up the hierarchy into direct measures. In your training, of this officer discretion, how confident are you about the ability of officers to actually understand and then exercise this very important discretion of escalation or non-escalation? Because I think what you're saying is sometimes we have to take into account the circumstances and of the offence and the circumstances of the individual. So just give us an idea of the confidence of the outcome of your training.
Well, having spent time with student officers who passed out last Friday, I took the opportunity to ask them about their knowledge and to check their knowledge around direct measures, and I have to say I was hugely reassured. They knew what they were, and also the requirement to take a proportionate approach, which is very much what we are suggesting. Of course, this does not take away from the fact that there is that continuum. It's very important that officers are aware of that. It's certainly something I'm familiar with, it's certainly something my colleagues are familiar with, that there is that spectrum, and I suppose what we are trying to do within that is broaden that scope slightly in terms of what offences can be dealt with and what the circumstances are that would be worthy of a direct measure. But I think you're absolutely right, and we also have a precedent set in terms of course, road traffic offences where speeding tickets have been used for a very long time, and knowing that that can change people's behaviour. So I think our officers are very attuned to that, and I will have a high degree of confidence, certainly in terms of the figures, that we are using them and using them appropriately. Thank you.
Superintendent Campbell?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. No, just to continue on from the ACC, I think, the one thing that we emphasise in the training is round about the importance of discretion. And that's built through our probationer training all the way through to our SIO training around that. But it is that wider consideration around recorded police warnings and antisocial behaviour, fixed penalty notices, around about what are we dealing with at this particular time. So about that assessment when you are dealing with an incident and what is the proportionate and reasonable response to that. Now that may be simply advice and direction provided by the officer, but thereafter there may be an escalation process which may thereafter take you into simply noting the individual's details and warning them, but thereafter it may be a recorded police warning or a fixed penalty notice. And again, the option when about escalation to a standard police report back into COPFS is a further consideration, but that's based on, as the ACC indicated, about the nature of the crime or offence you're dealing with, the offending behaviour once we do any background checks of the particular individual concerned, any particular mitigating circumstances, but also it was really important about the impact on the victim. So about that victim engagement and about the support for the victim at that particular time when we're dealing with it at the nearest point of the commission of the crime.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll come back to that. I think my experience of the time I've been on the board is that officer discretion is the greatest asset of policing in Scotland, and it's one of its greatest threats, and how we deal with that. We all want officers to have discretion in dealing with us. We don't want to go, well, it's 31 miles an hour, you're booked. But we also have to, as you're rightly saying, both of you, that has to be checked and double checked that that's exercised properly and proportionately. So thank you very much to both of you. Great start. And I didn't know it's almost 8,000 since September, so that puts it in the context of 6%, I think you said, of crime. So I'm now going to, thank you very much, Wendy Middleton, excellent presentation. Move on to Jenny Hamilton from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, who will be covering the Lord Advocate's guidelines. Jenny, over to you.
Morning. So I'm Jenny Hamilton. I work in the policy team at the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. And I've been invited along today to talk about the Lord Advocate's guidelines on police direct measures. So I've got some slides. Moving to the second slide, which sets out the plan today, is to provide an overview of the rationale for the use of direct measures as prosecutors understand it, what the Lord Advocate's guidelines cover and what they don't, and the measures in place for monitoring and reporting from our perspective. And I won't dwell too much on that because you've had a very comprehensive explanation already from ACC Middleton. But before I get on to that, I want to explain a little bit here about the Scottish context, because I think it's really useful to understand in Scotland the relationship between police and prosecutors, which differs from England and Wales, and so why the guidelines come from the Lord Advocate rather than the Chief Constable or the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, for example. So in Scotland, it's traditionally said that prosecutors fulfil the role of gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. So we are the ones that consider, in most cases, the public interest in prosecutorial action, and we do so within a frame of policy, of specialist units and of expertise, which provide a consistent approach to the prosecution of crime in Scotland. And in Scotland, apart from in limited circumstances, such as in the use of direct measures, which we'll discuss, where there's sufficient evidence of an offence, police are bound to report the case to the prosecutor. The overall system of responsibility for the system of prosecution in crime in Scotland rests with the Lord Advocate, who takes decisions in relation to the prosecution of crime independently of anybody else. And this is a system which has evolved over time and exists at common law, in writings, in court judgments, but it's also one that we find in legislation. So, for example, in terms of Section 12 of the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 95, the Lord Advocate can issue instruction to the Chief Constable with regard to reporting offences. And more recently, in the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act, the Chief Constable must, when directing her constables, police cadets and police staff, comply with any lawful instruction given by the prosecutor or by instruction from the Lord Advocate. So where the police are to use direct measures, the Lord Advocate is ultimately responsible for the entire system of prosecutions and prosecutorial action in Scotland, has issued guidelines on how they should be used. But that's not to say that these guidelines were not developed in partnership with the police. They very much were, and I'll come on to that in a moment. You can move on to the next slide, thanks. So I'm just going to reiterate what police direct measures are, and I won't go into too much detail, but just to note that fixed penalty notices were established by the Anti-Social Behaviour Scotland Act 2004, and the level of the fixed penalty was set in 2005. The list of offences for which fixed penalties can be used is set by the Scottish Parliament. That's not set by prosecutors. The recorded police warning scheme, though, was introduced in January 2016, and that was at the same time as the system of formal adult warnings was discontinued. Now, interestingly, though, well, I think interestingly, formal adult warnings were recommended in 1983 by the Stewart Committee, which was established to consider ways that we could relieve pressure on the criminal justice system. So it goes back some way. This is not a new innovation. What is new is the fact that these guidelines are published, and I'll come on to talk about the reasons for that. A couple of points just to highlight about both direct measures. Neither of them constitute a conviction or require an admission of guilt, and that is a point of distinction from the situation in England. They are voluntary, though, and they have to be accepted by the accused. They're instantly spent in terms of your criminal record, in terms of the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, but they are recorded on the police criminal history system for police and for prosecutors to review. And it's worth mentioning also the prosecutors in Scotland have a range of direct measures available to themselves. So, for example, fiscal fines, compensation orders, fiscal work orders, they've been made available to prosecutors by Parliament over the last decades. Prosecutors can also issue warning letters. They can offer a referral to local authorities, social work team, or third sector agencies, and that's what we would call diversion from prosecution proper. The other measures might be described as diversionary measures, but diversion from prosecution is its own really unique process that involves that referral to local authorities to provide assistance and to support an individual. And when prosecutors use direct measures, we are bound by the terms of the publicly available prosecution code and any prosecution policy that's provided for by the Lord Advocate. And so the reason just for drawing that out is that we have a well-established history of alternatives to prosecution in Scotland, and that the choice that officers are making is not necessarily a binary one. So it's not a choice between offering a police direct measure and then attending as a witness for prosecution in court. There's a range of available options for prosecutors in that space in between. So moving on to the next slide then, around the rationale for direct measures. So from a prosecutor's perspective, the main drivers for antisocial behaviour fixed penalty notices and reported police warnings are that they are swift and proportionate. On that main point, police warnings, as already been said, offer a speedy resolution, maintaining that link between the commission of the offence and the imposition of a penalty, and providing certainty for the public at the outset, so victims and witnesses and accused don't have to wait to find out what's happening with their case. And there's a clear public interest in that swift justice. But of course it should also be proportionate, and there's no rule in Scotland that every offence needs to be prosecuted, and the system as a whole aims to deal with offending in as proportionate a manner as possible. So the guidelines themselves proceed on the basis that there are cases which, if reported to the Procurator Fiscal, are likely to result in a warning, a low-level fiscal fine, a so-called fiscal fine being offered, and that these offences may be proportionately and efficiently dealt with by the police without a report to the Procurator Fiscal being required. So in terms of the numbers of those cases, CUPFS analysis showed, for example, that there's a relatively large number of cases that continued to be dealt with by prosecutors, either by way of this marking of no action, marking that action would be disproportionate, or these low-level fines. And that's around 8,000 in 22-23 and around 6,000 in 23-24. So that analysis was done as part of the review of the Lord Advocate's guidelines, just to test the proposition that there were offences that could be efficiently, proportionately dealt with by police at an earlier stage. So I want also just to return to a point, and I'm anticipating a criticism here that's been made that it's just about cost savings. These are cases in which the accused doesn't contest their involvement. These are cases where there's not likely to be a trial, and we know that there's a large number of cases in the system which do resolve by way of a guilty plea. And as I say, that direct measure allows the case to be dealt with. So a prosecutor would deal with it without the unnecessary use of scarce public resources and the requirement for the police to complete a full police report, or for prosecutors to consider and prepare a case, which would ultimately resolve. So I understand that there's a potential power imbalance, and a critic would make the point that if the choice for an accused is between a fine and being prosecuted in court, how much of a choice is that really? And I think the rejoinder would have to be that we know that those cases resolve at an early stage, and that it's perfectly reasonable for the system to have proportionate measures in place for dealing with those types of cases. So just moving on to the slide, really the meat of it here, I suppose, the centre of the presentation, what the Lord Advocate guidelines cover and what they don't. So the guidelines are designed to to be used by police officers but read by the public. So they should be clear, they should be easily accessible, and I'll just draw out a few points. So firstly, there has to be a sufficiency of evidence before a direct measure can be offered. So in Scotland that means corroborated evidence that an offence was committed and it was the accused that committed the offence. So nothing in the Lord Advocate's guidelines or the use of police direct measures weakens or dilutes the principles of the criminal law in Scotland. The second point is that police direct measure scheme extends only to less serious offences. So the assessment for the seriousness of an offence is for individual officers based on specific facts and circumstances of the case before them, or the circumstances before them. But to assist the police and to provide reassurance to the public, specific guidance is provided on the type of circumstances in which a police direct measure would not be an appropriate response. So it will not be appropriate, we've heard, when it involves an allegation of sexual offending, domestic abuse, conduct involving hate crime, infliction of injury which is more than superficial, persistent and alarming conduct which is part of the operation of serious and organised crime, and where there's substantial economic harm to an individual or community where no reparation has been made. These are the cases where, for very good public policy reasons, it's been assessed that they require further detailed consideration within that framework of policy and expertise that prosecutors can provide in order to determine what the most appropriate outcome is. The next point is that the guidelines provide both this list, a list of eligible offences, and these general principles. And the reason for that is because merely to make a list of eligible offences, it wouldn't suffice. Many of the offences under common law and under statute, they bring under one legal definition diverse forms of conduct, causing different degrees of harm. So for example, a breach of the peace may range from shouting in the street to something approaching a riot. And we decided nor would it be satisfactory to define minor offences by the normal sentence or average fine imposed by the court, because that same penalty could cover a great range of circumstances. And so we have a compromise, a list of eligible offences and those overarching principles intended to provide an accessible, consistent and transparent framework. The other point, which has already been mentioned, is that officers should consider the views of the victim when considering the most appropriate action. Those views are, for very good public policy reasons, not determinative. As the ACC has pointed out, justice will mean different things for different people. And whilst it's important that officers understand the impact on individuals, it wouldn't be fair or equitable if there was a different result based on a complainant's different views or different approaches. The police in this context, like prosecutors, are making that assessment about the public interest balancing a range of factors. Officers are asked to take a graduated approach and consider what has previously happened to the individual. But they're not bound to an escalatory approach necessarily. There's no 3 strikes and you're out rule. There's no set limit on the number of times that individuals can be offered a direct measure. It has to be recalled, though, that it is a low-level financial penalty or a warning, and so where there's repeated or escalatory behaviour, it's unlikely that that low-level response is going to be appropriate. Neither offering or accepting a police direct measure is mandatory. Police officers retain the ability to report appropriate cases to the Procurator Fiscal, and accused persons retain the right to reject the offer where they contest or deny those allegations. And where the offence is one that can't be dealt with by a direct measure and it's reported to the Procurator Fiscal, that does not present, in fact neither offering a police direct measure nor reporting the case prevents an officer referring a vulnerable accused to support services through signposting or through any referral scheme that may exist. And that's something, in fact, we'd be keen to encourage, and Gemma Fraser from Community Justice Scotland might touch on in her input. So why is it being published now? This is the next slide, if you can. Well, we understand that over the last year or so there's been considerable public and political interest in the guidelines, and the Lord Advocate is committed to transparency and accountability in the work of the Crown Office. And the clear direction of travel in Scotland is that where instructions to police or prosecutors can appropriately be published, they will be. But care, of course, must be taken in making that assessment. It's not appropriate to publish guidance which, not appropriate to publish any guidance which would undermine or prejudice police operations or the prevention and detection of crime. In relation to police direct measures, for example, We would want to avoid a situation where an individual feels emboldened to commit a crime on the basis that they believe they'd only ever receive a direct measure. So the wording is important. The wording that's used in the Lord Advocate's guidelines is really important, and there has to be a balance between clear and accessible guidance for the public and that allowing that flexibility to officers to respond to unique circumstances. So following extensive engagement with the police, working in partnership with them, the guidelines were formally provided to the police and published on the COPPS website in August this year. I would say that advance copies were sent to the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, as well as the Justice Committee, whose members had an interest for their information only and for their awareness. And then the police went live with the use of direct measures, or the Lord Advocate's guidelines on direct measures in September. So very briefly, because we've already heard about monitoring and accountability, move to the last slide where we've heard now about the training that's been put in place, the regular review of direct measures. First review is taking place later this month to review the initial bed-in period and to consider what may be changed. From a Crown perspective, Procurator Fiscals are committed to a regular review of the direct measures to ensure that they are meeting the needs of officers, that they are clear and transparent, and that if any of the eligible offences for recorded police warnings are required to be updated, either removed or added to. So there'll be that continuing iterative development. It is not a static document. It will continue to respond to the needs of the police and the public. So that's all I wanted to say.
Fantastic, Jenny. Very, very clear explanation. I've got a couple of questions just for you. Maybe you can't answer them, but how you said a warning would remain on the police recording system. How long would it remain on that system? 2 years. And what impact does that have on terms of a disclosure requirement? Does that have to be disclosed? Back to that. And I'd also like all the panel to think about under 18-year-olds. I would like a conversation at the end of all the presentations about how these may or may not be applied to under 18-year-olds.
These do not apply to 18-year-olds. There's a separate framework which is under review in light of the Children's Care and Justice Bill and the changes that brings around, including referral to the Children's Reporter for all under 18-year-olds. So the simple answer is these do not apply. There's a separate, not yet published framework that exists in relation to children.
I was just trying to make clear that there is a related set of discretions that police officers can apply to under 18-year-olds. As you say, the guidance hasn't yet, maybe never published by the Lord Advocate, but I'd like to come back just to have a brief conversation as a panel together about how that might be. As an authority, we're very interested in the policing of children under 18-year-olds, and we might just come back and have another open session about that issue. So thank you for that clarity. A very clear presentation. So I think you're saying, as I got it, about 6,000 a diversion from prosecution or direct measures as a combination of those two. Is that what you said?
Direct measures. So when we're considering police direct measures, I would take diversion from prosecution completely out of the question. Diversion from prosecution is that ability for the prosecutor to refer an individual to a local authority to provide them with treatment support, to deal with the issues that have contributed to the offending, whilst police direct measures may be described as diversionary, as in they divert somebody away from the criminal justice system, I would separate them out from diversion from prosecution. From our perspective, when I was referencing the 6,000 figure, that was when we were looking at cases that had been dealt with by prosecutors in the last year or so by way of these low-level fines, by warning letters, or by marking cases as actions disproportionate. So we looked at those numbers and we thought, we don't think those are huge numbers, but there is room clearly for the police to deal with those types of cases at an earlier stage in proceedings.
Helpful for me to understand these very clear distinctions you're making. Can I just come back on it as I understand the numbers? Wendy is saying around 8,000 police issued direct measures. I think you're now saying about 6,000?
No, I'm sorry. Police have been able to use recorded police warnings already. So what I'm saying is when we looked at them, we wanted to test the proposition that there are cases in the system that could be dealt with earlier and more proportionately by police, because when these types of cases are reported to prosecutors, we're issuing low-level fines or warning letters. So if we're doing that, there's a proportion of cases that the police could also be doing that with.
Sorry for being so slow. Pat, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, it was just to expand on the difference between the diversion from prosecution and the direct measure, which Jenny kind of picked up on, and again the role of the police on that. I mean, that responsibility sits with Jenny and COPFS around the suitability for diversion. But the work we're doing just now around about the standard prosecution report, the report that we submit through to COPFS, providing that additional information around the suitability of that particular individual for diversion. So providing as much information around about the background, around about the circumstances, around about the history of the individual, medical, psychological, neurodiversity issues, anything at all that we can add to the report to provide that more solid framework about how that decision making can be made by COPFS now. So again, the role of diversion for Police Scotland is simply that, to provide as much detail and information as possible into COPFS.
I think we're going to come back about what the future trends might be, because I take it that this combination of things that could have been dealt with by a direct measure that comes into your offices and what is actually happening at the moment could see, if we had the training and the confidence in policing, the direct measures go up quite considerably without actually going up quite considerably, if you see what I mean. They have just applied it more directly with greater confidence earlier in the process. I'd like to come back to that, because that will be a big data issue when it comes through. Certainly the police authority, we've got to be understanding of the data there. So I can move on to Dr. Gabrielle Watson. Welcome, Gabrielle, to this seminar. And Gabrielle is a fellow of the University of Edinburgh and going to give us an academic perspective on what we've been talking about. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'm grateful for the invitation to offer an academic perspective on police direct measures in Scotland and to promote public understanding of their use. Now, much contemporary policing scholarship emphasises the need for the police to be involved in a continual dialogue with the public about how they work and the decisions that they make. This is a process which I think requires careful listening, as well as a commitment to having serious conversations with the community about the rationale behind police policies, priorities and actions. There's a related body of research on police legitimacy, which shows that the police can only carry out their work successfully with the support and cooperation of the public. So for these reasons, I'm delighted that this event is taking place. My aim in this presentation is quite simple: to survey the advantages and potential disadvantages of police direct measures in light of the Lord Advocate's 2024 guidelines. I'd also like to draw attention to the principles which are driving the implementation of these measures in practice, namely proportionality, transparency and discretion. Now, we're in the tricky position that Aside from the statistical data, no robust academic research yet exists on the operation of police direct measures in Scotland. But what I can do, however, is draw upon some evidence from other countries where similar schemes exist and have been implemented, as well as the broader policing literature, in order to make some informed predictions as to how these powers are likely to play out in the Scottish context. Now, as we've already heard this morning, police direct measures for adults are issued by officers to those aged 18 and over. The measures were introduced in January 2016, which coincided with the phasing out of the formal adult warnings scheme. As we know, a direct measure can be issued in the form of a recorded police warning or an antisocial behaviour fixed penalty notice. And these measures must be issued within 28 days of the alleged offence, and give police officers the option to enforce the law for less serious offending in a manner that is proportionate, prompt, and efficient. Now, it seems important to me to note that a direct measure is just one police power within a diverse policing toolkit. So at one end of the spectrum, police officers retain the discretion to issue a verbal warning or take no further action. On the other end of the spectrum, police officers may proceed to report offences to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal. And so the police direct measure scheme, it seems to me, represents a kind of middle ground. And in my view, these measures are best viewed as a constructive and pragmatic response to a class of cases which are too serious to be ignored or dealt with informally, but which are not so serious as to call for prosecution. As we've already heard, although the offender's details will be retained by Police Scotland for 2 years, they do not require an admission of guilt, and offenders are free to accept or reject the offer. And in this way, the scheme should be clearly distinguished from a criminal conviction. That the offender has that right to opt for prosecution than a trial instead is perhaps the most compelling justification for the scheme. Now, it seems to me that the Scottish direct measures scheme has several redeeming features. First, the scheme permits officers on a case-by-case basis to use their discretion to resolve offending behaviour at or near the offence. There's great value in preventing people from entering the justice system unnecessarily. That traditional process of prosecution, trial, conviction is potentially slow, it's cumbersome, it's sometimes ineffective, especially so since courts continue to grapple with COVID-19 case backlogs. The direct measures scheme then might be seen as part of a broader move that we've witnessed in many Western countries in recent decades to move lesser offending out of the formal criminal process. In the academic research, this is known as diversion, although we've already heard today that that term has certain subtleties in the Scottish context in terms of how we understand it and apply it. But nonetheless, there is a strong evidence base that these early interventions can reduce harm in a way that is potentially superior to these later interventions, while potentially also achieving a wider economic and social benefit. A few notes on the Lord Advocate's guidelines then. So it seems to me that they're particularly valuable in providing greater transparency about the kinds of offences that are deemed both appropriate and inappropriate for direct measures. So appropriate offences, as we've heard, include assault, breach of the peace, wasting police time, various offences involving alcohol. And inappropriate offences include an allegation of a sexual offence, allegation of domestic abuse, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable members of our community, and hate crime. Now, this move to differentiate between lesser and more serious offending is, I think, an important one. The research shows that the legitimacy of the justice system hinges in part on making these kinds of moral distinctions between different types of criminal offence and how we respond to them. So if the police were seen to respond to a physical assault of a woman, for example, in the same way as they do to a minor offence such as drunkenness in a public place, the implication then is that the state views the conduct as broadly equivalent in ethical terms, and that approach, of course, would be plainly wrong. Now, a common misconception, you might say, about this highly transparent approach to policing, as we see in the Lord Advocate's guidelines, is that it may allow potential offenders to pay close attention to the guideline and to circumvent the law by restricting their offending to conduct which will fall short of formal prosecution. But I'm not particularly concerned that the guidelines will be interpreted in that way. The criticism is not a particularly powerful one, and it's not typically how offending works, particularly when it's spontaneous or opportunistic. Now, at point 5 of the new guideline, the Lord Advocate emphasises the fundamental principle of discretion in administering a direct measure. Discretion is essential to the operation of the scheme. Without it, we lose compassion for the particular circumstances of offending behaviour and potentially sidestep the relevance of any aggravating or mitigating factors. At point 7 of the guideline, the Lord Advocate notes the relevance of proportionality. In other words, of ensuring that the police response matches the offence. Now, it would be deeply unethical to meet low-level offending with a disproportionate or overly punitive response. The principles of discretion and proportionality are not new in criminal justice research and have long been deemed essential to effective policing practice, and I was pleased to see them play out in the guideline itself. And then, of course, finally, there's this pragmatic value to the scheme, which promises, I think, a clear benefit to the public. There's something to be said for swift justice. Direct measures guarantee quick resolution of an instance of offending. They reduce paperwork. They free up the courts to deal with more serious matters. Offenders are required to face up to their offending much sooner, while avoiding that formal criminal process. Now, it seems to me that one way of guaranteeing the success of the police recorded warning scheme is to ensure it is consistent with an influential body of academic research called procedural justice. Now, the key finding of that research is very simple. Police encounters with the public, which are characterised by fairness, impartiality and respect, and which give people a voice, will promote police legitimacy and greater compliance with the law. There's a groundbreaking US study of procedural justice entitled Why People Obey the Law. And the author, Tom Tyler, found that citizens were much more likely to comply with rules if they viewed legal institutions, including the police, as legitimate. And whether they viewed those institutions as legitimate was determined much more by the perception of their process rather than the outcome itself. That study was replicated in England and Wales, and Jonathan Jackson and others showed something very similar, that public trust in procedurally fair policing predicts greater compliance. This happens, I think, because fair treatment signals to people that the police are in moral alignment with their beliefs. In other words, that the police are on their side. Now, I have good reason to expect that Police Scotland are implementing direct measures in a way that promotes procedural justice. These and other similar studies, I think, provide a clear message for police agencies. Legitimacy matters, not just in ethical terms, but as a component of a evidence-based crime control strategy. And if police agencies can routinely demonstrate fairness and respect in their administration of direct measures, they are more likely, I think, to meet with a cooperative population. Now, in the interests of a fair and balanced discussion, I will draw upon the international policing literature to flag some potential risks of this scheme. It's important that they're placed on the table, but I have yet to see evidence that these issues are playing out in a very serious way in the Scottish context. Nonetheless, there is first a concern about consistency. So in a police warning scheme in England and Wales, research showed that, and I quote, low visibility discretion led to inconsistent decisions by the police, that the same offending behaviour was being disposed of differentially, depending on officer and depending on community. Second, there is a concern about the subjective nature of offending itself. So in other words, which behaviours in fact truly merit a direct measure. So what might be abusive to someone who has lived in refined circumstances might not be abusive to someone who has been raised in poverty or other forms of social disadvantage. What is disorderly for a senior citizen might not be disorderly among a group of 18-year-olds. And likewise, the experience of harassment, of alarm, of distress is fundamentally a subjective matter, and I think its identification is far from a clear-cut exercise. Third, there's a concern about equality of impact. The type of behaviour that attracts these measures, such as public drunkenness, is also more likely, the research tells us at least, to be committed by the most vulnerable members of our society. Without robust oversight, the scheme has the potential to marginalise yet further those members of our society already suffering from social exclusion. Finally, there is, and I think it's of particular note, is the potential for something called net widening. So net widening refers to more individuals being included within the scope of an intervention than originally intended. The risk is that schemes of this kind move the goalposts so that the police may take action at a lower threshold. However, the message from the research community is clear. Warnings should not be used for those who would not, in the absence of this scheme, have received some kind of court or out-of-court disposal. Now, one way I think to guard against these risks is for us to revisit the scheme regularly, to track its effectiveness, and especially in light of the changing contexts in which policing takes place. I'm thinking here of increasing socio-economic division, political disagreement, technological change that we're witnessing in the 2020s. Another strategy will be to ensure that the law in the books reflects the law in practice. In other words, that policing practice reflects the Lord Advocate's guidelines as closely and as meticulously as possible. And then finally, I would call for carefully designed and robust academic research on the reality of police direct measures in Scottish communities, including how they are being received and interpreted by the public. So overall, I am optimistic. I am optimistic about the police direct measures scheme in Scotland and welcome the Lord Advocate's 2024 guidelines on their use. I hope that this relatively new addition to the policing toolkit will encourage the public to think in new ways about how best to deal with low-level offending, and more generally to support the police in their mission to ensure a safe, cohesive and just society. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Gabrielle. Very interesting overview. You said, well, a couple of questions for you. You said it's under-researched as an area. Can you give us any indication or any view you may have about what we can draw about reoffending rates in this relatively Well, within this measure, and if we can draw any conclusions from that at all, from the evidence, if there is any.
Thank you. Yes, it is a shame that we do not yet have robust academic research in the area. Partly, I think, is to do with this is a relatively new form of intervention in Scottish criminal justice, and partly it's to do with availability of funding for academics to pursue this kind of work. But at least from my survey of research on similar schemes in other jurisdictions, including in England and Wales, there does seem to be a suggestion that these lower level, earlier styles of intervention can promote reduced reoffending. Of course, we have to be mindful about making these strict or these straightforward comparisons between different jurisdictions. Of course, Scotland has its distinctive almost restorative style or approach to criminal justice. But there is some scope for optimism based on some of the research coming out of the areas.
One more. You emphasise procedural justice as a way of increasing public confidence in policing by consent. It strikes me that that's rather an offender view about somebody who's subject to the police intervention. I have evidence, not evidence, I have heard the counter view that the view of the victim or the view of the public is more interested in outcomes rather than procedural justice. Is that part of the academic conversation about how you balance outcomes and process?
Absolutely. So it's true that research on procedural justice primarily emphasises the quality of the interaction and the legitimacy of the process over the outcome. But actually, this is a burgeoning field. There's a fantastic research centre at Yale in the US working called the Justice Lab, working with precisely this kind of research, and there has been a move to push boundaries of that research beyond the original vision, and to think about whether procedural justice might have that more instrumental or practical use in reducing reoffendment. And the emerging evidence seems to suggest that yes, it can. So for sure, the primary focus of that work was on the quality of the interaction, but increasing empirical studies suggest that there could be a positive outcome in terms of reoffending.
Very clear, we're going to come back. I am curious, and I hope we can pick this up in the conversation, about why hate crime is so clearly excluded from these direct measures, and what that then means is if we're trying to be proportionate in terms of our approach to these issues. I'm open about that, but I'd be very interested in any views that people have as we come to the plenary session. So our final speaker is Gemma Fraser. Thank you very much for attending, Gemma. Gemma Fraser from Community Justice Scotland, and we'll be discussing the impact on our community of this approach. Thank you for attending.
Thank you for having me. And Community Justice Scotland, I'm Gemma Fraser. I head up a couple of teams in general other jobs in Community Justice Scotland, but my two main areas of work are around rolling out restorative justice and how that can look across Scotland and its access, and the other, probably the unenviable one at the moment, is that I look at system recovery from the pandemic and thereafter what has now become, we were talking earlier about a bit of a perma-crisis, but incredibly interesting work with a lot of colleagues around how we can improve how the system operates and what we understand about it. So I'll talk a little bit today about what Community Justice Scotland is and does in general, and then into how that sort of qualifies us to have a bit of a view on, I suppose, measures in general, but also how they could look and what they could be, I think, in terms of their engagement with communities, but also how they can impact on further offending. So my first slide is just to give you a wee bit of an overview. Community Justice Scotland is focused on looking at how we can reduce offending and further offending by addressing the causal factors of that and largely the needs that cause that in our communities in a number of ways. So we take the view that the community, as far as possible, should at public awareness, monitoring, promoting and supporting improvement around tests of change and methodology and a lot of data and information. We have a statutory role in keeping ministers informed about community justice and some local practice of that across 32 local authority areas. We review the national outcomes and performance improvement framework around community justice, and again can report on that and make recommendations for its change and implementation. We have a fancy online hub that is about learning and development, and I'll share a little bit about that because it might be useful in some of the context we're talking about today. We do quite a lot of work around commissioning, most recently supporting the new food care contract for Scotland, which was recently awarded, and how that will be monitored going forward for individuals who are in short-term custody and returning to communities. We also work very closely with both national and local community justice partners, and again reviewing outcome improvement plans which are held by each of the 32 local authority areas, and provide an overview to communities to which they are responsible for how partners are coming together in local areas to improve community justice outcomes for their own communities, and then obviously with us as national oversight how we can benefit from those things moving forward. So how we identify and provide advice on justice and other sources really informs what comes next, and my next slide just gives an overview, I suppose, of what we mean by community sentencing. It is massively vague. I think when people consider what we talk about in community sentencing, they jump straight to community payback orders and those areas of work. In actual fact, the breadth of what we cover when we talk about community is really any engagement between justice, universal and needs-based services that support people to reduce their offending or further offending in any way. So some of the examples up here will relate to unpaid work and the more obvious parts of community justice, but some will be accessible, as Jenny Hamilton pointed out, through diversion as another method of achieving, and really any direct measure that we can put into a community should support our ability to access some of the things that we know are available and can be provided to individuals whatever their needs are. I'll move on to my next slide, because that's the important bit. Okay, in relation to the Lord Advocate's guidelines on police direct measures, there are a number of points which support individuals to benefit from existing community services, partnerships, interventions and tools. This simply requires a willingness to dig a little deeper around the causes of offending and the lives of those we meet in communities, and awareness of what might benefit them more greatly than justice responses where appropriate. So the first point is around the discretion to use a verbal warning and to take no action. I really love the point that Dr. Watson made about without discretion we lose compassion. I think I'll be stealing that from future presentations. But firstly, most evidence and research will tell us that outcomes resulting from justice contact, so that keeping people out of the system or not allowing individuals to become too entrenched in that system actually will reduce the likelihood of becoming involved in it at all. So with that in mind, discretion is very, very important then. With an option where we can affect change through our actions, we can also affect change through our inaction. And it's just, I suppose, to start from that point of view. It's particularly important when dealing with low-level offences, and thus those considered, as we've talked about, for direct measure. The justice system is a proven vacuum. Hovering around its edges, almost hovering around its edges, can suck you in further. This means that where it is possible to give a verbal warning or to take no action, just give that full consideration as opposed to the first instance. In the same way the Crown do when they have cases, and everybody thereafter does in a justice system. The second point to pick up on is the consideration to victims' views and local concerns about particular types of offending behaviour. And it was really comforting to hear ACC Middleton talk about that idea that justice is personal, that it means something completely different. So it is incredibly difficult, particularly in the instances of an offence, to fully understand what a victim will need from the response. They'll need something different potentially then to what they'll need 2 weeks from then. They'll need something different to me, even if it is the same offence. So it's important to take that in, but think about how then can we understand that better. So the views of those harmed by crime are critical to shaping our response to it, but that said, views can change over time, and it's important to consider where restorative opportunities may exist to support a victim to be heard, to address unanswered questions, and to heal from their experiences first and foremost. Ensuring victims are informed on restorative and victim support services is crucial. We're working with Scottish Government to develop currently restorative justice action plans point about understanding what communities actually expect from us and the response that we make. Again, there are restorative options that can be considered here too. So it's important to understand how they really feel about the issues that impact them and what they actually want in a response to those. So again, restorative approaches to community engagement will prove effective in achieving this, and joint working with community justice partnerships to complete that, while affording opportunities for communities to address their own needs are important. We can very often take a step back and achieve more change and buy-in if we actually ask them what they want and how they might be responsible for addressing these problems. We don't have to do it all, and I think we've become very used to that in justice as that safety net that we take on a lot. There is a lot of capacity out there, and sometimes we find that it comes to that approach. It goes again back to the point about how do the public receive and see the measures that we've taken, and how then we can also use the studies to understand that better. So offending duty needs is the point from the guidance. Offending duty needs or vulnerabilities may make a direct measure inappropriate, and officers should consider reporting to safety effects for a diversion from prosecution. And I think Jenny Hamilton's covered this very well and exactly what that means. We know that some previous offending can be an indicator of the likelihood of further offending, but that isn't the case in all cases, so it's important to consider this. The National Guidance on Diversion from Prosecution provides a concise list of areas of need an individual may experience, which can indicate their suitability for any form of diversion from prosecution. It was designed by Crown Office to support improved decision making in this area, and it's something that really can be applied here as it can later to direct measures on how to proceed. Use of this in line with available guidance or information on trauma-informed practice can support good conversations about the right answer over simply justice answer. So I'll give a link to that later so we can think about what to do. There are a range of services in communities that can take referrals from police to support those with needs and vulnerabilities at the earliest stage, where that is an appropriate response. A diversion from prosecution is still a justice response, and part of the effective use of discretion must be an awareness of what else might be provided that can prevent further offending at the early stage. CGS have available a Community Justice Supports and Intervention Directory, which can signpost officers to available services by age, gender, area and needs. Additionally, local community justice partnerships will hold this information, and it may be possible to consider local improvement projects around police direct measures, which align certain types of offending to direct support access. And again, this goes back to some of the points made about avoiding that further social exclusion. We know that the same communities are involved in certain types of offending. If we can understand where local areas are experiencing offending, what then you are issuing measures for, it is possible to think about then what support access officers you might need to avoid these direct measures becoming a blunt tool, and to have that initial least referral option where it might be possible to do that and appropriate in cases of offence. A final point, and it would be remiss of me as someone not to mention monitoring and data reporting. We're all data crazy at the moment, but are we asking the right questions and considering the potential unintended consequences of our actions? The right question in this instance is, what could the use of police direct measures bring to reducing further offending and improving the experience of certain harm types for our local communities? Without first imagining that and putting steps in place to enhance their use, we will risk it becoming a blunt tool in our arsenal when addressing that bigger picture. So there's a couple of points brought up already around data and information. So it is important to think about what are our key areas of offending that are and will be addressed in that manner. What does satisfaction look like, but what does change mean? So making sure that data answers the questions and is not just gathered for the purposes of data we have or hold. An interesting point made already even is about comparable figures. So where we're talking about whether or not the impact becomes if police direct measures increase while Crown then see a reduction in theirs, comparable time periods even as a basic, it is difficult when you're able to record figures from September and we're quoting figures then from 23-24. So it's as basic as making sure that we have some of those things right, and that's the point of the chairman. My last slide, because I speak really fast, and to make sure that I don't miss what I actually trying to say. Always consider the least invasive justice option where possible, and that goes for any type of we are in a position, in a privileged position, to think about how the justice system is used in someone's life. Because it is not just then that you impact it. It may be for an awful lot longer and have a much greater impact to other areas of their lives and that of the communities. Consider restorative approaches across communities with individuals. So that is restorative justice, obviously, but also the language that you use, which is just about being trauma responsive, the way you conduct conversations in these circumstances, and a lot of that goes back to the discussion about where we approach in one way, what we get back will be something that we can live with and manage. Circles, again, around communities are also excellent intelligence gathering opportunities in lots of ways. And when we address low-level things in a way that the public appreciate and understand and want things addressed, we will increase their likelihood to report other things, the likelihood for them to come forward with the types of crime and information that we really do want to change at a much bigger level. So I think it's what you invest is what you get back in that circumstance. As I mentioned, there are national guidelines, and I should say before someone else does, these are currently under review, but I don't think it's part of the change fencing, that set out in diversion from prosecution things to consider when making decisions or recommendations about how to proceed in the system. Those cover mental health, alcohol and drugs, vulnerabilities, disability, attitude of offending, family dynamics, education and employment. That's on page 5 of that national guidance. I have the precisely circulated links in out there. Community justice partnerships are your key local way to thinking about what is out there and how they might work to help you think about this differently. And I hope Karen Crosby is at the bottom. Think about what else this could look like. Because that should be the first question I think that we pose when we're putting anything new in. What is it we want to achieve? Therefore, what could it look like? They could help you think about what the development of positive referral routes might be that are linked into evidence of what your issues actually are and how those might be supported. And it takes a huge burden from the justice system in lots of ways, because around that table you look at third sector, private sector, a whole host of things that people are part of that. And my final two links are to our Community Justice Intervention Support Directory, which is constantly being updated by services with their information. If you search in that for, I don't know, Aberdeen City, and you're looking for drug and alcohol support for someone aged between 25 and 35, female, who also has a range of other needs, you will be able to pull back information from that and provide services that can be contacted, their contact details, needs, what they can support with. So the tool is designed primarily for the judiciary to help with them thinking about making those community decisions, particularly digital and working in different ways. But it's open to everybody, and it's accessible through our website to anyone who can use this to help. And we've had good conversations about its use across police custody. We've been able to provide individuals with QR codes and things that they can access themselves if they want to help. Just can't improve what signposting something to them. And the final point is about the Community Justice Learning Hub. That's the panacea of all things community justice. And anything, hopefully, that you want to learn more about, whether it's restorative justice progress, whether it's about social work learning, whether it is around policy and improvement and some of that national outcome stuff around different areas, your information is there. And it'll include information around your community justice partnerships also.
Much. Chairman, just a couple of questions to you. We've had a long-standing interest in the authority in the lower levels of competence in policing in some of our more under pressure communities where we've been doing some work over the last 2 years, really, finding out what they think would be. So you mentioned this as a critical aspect of competence in policing. And can you just link that to the community justice outcomes and say, is there any evidence that those justice outcomes are better in areas where there's been more engagement? And what would those outcomes, those better outcomes, look like? Is there evidence about that?
We look at that probably through a local lens. So one of the national outcomes that we report on annually is about our community justice partnerships' ability to engage with individuals at a local level. And we ask them to evidence in a number of ways how they do that. Part of that is about what the communities want to see change in community justice, and other part of that is around how they are responding to the existing national outcomes and the changes that we're implementing. taking that information back in is something that we as a national organisation look at should then be replicated in the output that we give back. We focused a lot on that thinking around restorative justice and what that could mean. I think the evidence is generally around satisfaction anyway, in terms of how we operate as services. People like to be asked, they want things that they want addressed. We know basically things like we will improve intelligence and gathering and the reporting of the crime we want to see reported, we address the more level things, and that's why partnerships are important. We know that councils who will offer different ways for people to talk and engage will be able to share that more widely and will prefer different referral routes. So there's probably a number of ways that we evidence that in both soft and hard outcome terms, I think. But the data will be there in our annual reports yearly around those outcomes.
I'm going to take a short break so we can adjust some of our sound problems. But before we go, it has struck me in my work with the Scottish Police Authority is just how unequal crime is distributed across our communities. I think the vast majority of us experience no crime from one year to the next. A minority of people experience the crime, and a minority of those people experience half of all crime. I reckon it's about 5% experience half of all crime. And crime is hyperlocal, and those concentrations are hyperlocal. So this community engagement, I think, is very important at the very local level in order that we can address this issue, because also it's complex. Sometimes those people who are victims of crime also may be acting in a way that is criminal within this low-level offending way. So I think it's highly complicated, and I'm always slightly wary when an academic says more research, but on this one, I think I'm fully supportive of it. And I would like, before we go to the break, I'd like more research myself to be with practitioners. I'd like that to be, the academics have a whole range of skills they can apply, but the evidence of professionals like yourself and practitioners really add real value to the outcomes of research and allows it to be practically focused rather than descriptive on these areas. So it's a 5-minute break to sort out our feedback issues, and we're going to come back for a plenary session. Thank you very much, everybody. So what we are now, hopefully sorted those for this short session now, and we're going to clean up the tape and put it online. So if you are interested in, I'm sure you will be on that first session, you'll be able to hear it all. And if you have any questions, just if you text in or write in, we'll try to sort that. So I'm really sorry about that. I wasn't aware of those. So what I'm going to do now is try to have a conversation rather than I ask a question and you answer it, but we're trying to have a conversation together. So feel free to go in and out. I think the first one is about the, basically, this is a discretionary activity, and I think it was Gabrielle who said, maybe it wasn't, we're talking about things which are too serious to be ignored and not serious enough, not serious enough to merit a verbal warning. So there's always going to be boundary issues here, issues where it could fall on one or other side of that boundary, and then exercise of discretion. So my first question really is to you, Wendy, is like monitoring this and then coming to the other panel about confidence in monitoring this and the evaluation. So first off.
Thank you, Chair. I recorded that as well. Too serious to ignore, not serious enough to prosecute. It was Gabrielle. I think what I've taken from the discussion today, which I find hugely helpful, Chair, is that the monitoring is not in and of itself about the data. And I think probably coming into this today, my eye was on the usage, the uptick, and the appropriateness of the issuing. But actually, there's so much more of it to consider. And I think we'll have to pick this up in the review as well, Jenny, in terms of our usage, because for me this is about understanding the crime types where we are issuing direct measures. It's about the demographics, so who is actually on the receiving end of the direct measures. And it's also about those people who find themselves receiving more than one direct measure and the reoffending that we were talking about as well. So for me, the monitoring is going to be really important, but not just the monitoring of the process and the usage, but actually the people that are coming through the system. And I think that ties in to a much wider conversation, Chair, around the landscape of criminality in Scotland, and that spectrum from very low-level brushes with the law right through to our serious and organised criminals that we really have. So I would like to come at it from both aspects now, the process, but also the people, and understand who's coming to the system.
One of the aspects of monitoring, I think Jenny raised this, was those which come through for prosecution, which are then, that's not the right way to deal with this. So I think you've got a good way of looking when you've overreached and put it into the prosecution system. I'm just wondering from your point of view, when police haven't taken an action and how that might affect consistency, but by some form of action. And the issues here is the length of time it's been trying to find ways of making justice swifter.
There's a whole great example of that is not really trying to move that kind of come to trial where we can report it by, for example, the digital evidence coming online next year from the camera with the great implementation. So there's a whole big scope. There's that trying to be education systems that contribute in certain areas, even if that is the case. Right?
to Gabrielle. We talked about swift justice there, and I think you didn't use these words, but you implied rough justice, in that the discretion applied could be applied wrongly in a discretional way. Talk about some of the evidence and who this might be applied to in disproportionality from your knowledge of the evidence.
Likely to be committed by the most vulnerable members of our society. So the point I was kind of trying to make was that without robust oversight, that direct measure scheme has the potential to marginalise further those members of the community who are already suffering from social exclusion. Now that's research evidence coming from England and Wales and beyond. I have yet to see any evidence to suggest that that is happening in Scotland, but of course it's something that we ought to guard against. I thought at this point I might also flag another kind of emerging area of criminal justice research. It's been simmering for many decades now, but it's coming forth quite strongly now, and it's the claim that criminal justice practice, including the police, is most effective when it combines proper ethical treatment alongside the pursuit of instrumental or practical objectives. So of course we should care about crime control and managing order within the community and the pursuit of targets, but that must always be kept in its proper place, and we must always have regard to those more ethical principles of respect, fairness, and so on.
Back to our police officers, and what's the internal view? Is this seen as a soft touch? Is this seen as not proper policing, or does it have a real place in the ethics of a modern? I'm thinking of the beat constable, the response constable. At that level, what's your take on how this is viewed in that professional policing context?
Sorry, having slight technical difficulties. I think it's viewed on a number of levels. I think there is very much an appreciation within the organisation, and of course across the justice sector, in terms of victim need and being responsive to victim needs, and also understanding that we do have delays. We had delays prior to COVID. They were certainly exacerbated by COVID, and all agencies are working to try and move beyond that. So I think there's a very practical responsiveness to the needs of victims, and trying to make sure that we do have that speed and agility to assist victims need. I think there's something from a demand perspective as well of our officers, in that they welcome this as another tool that they have that they can use straight away without having to go to the prosecution report that Pat referred to earlier. So there's something from a very practical point of view for the officer on the ground as well. But I'm really struck by the comments of Gabrielle, because I jotted down whenever she was speaking. This to me goes to the heart of our policing together strategy and our values as Police Scotland. It doesn't sit in isolation, and that those values are a golden thread that run throughout everything we do, in terms of how we select our officers, in terms of the training that we provide our officers, and in terms of the trust that we put in them as well. And they are professional. They are professionals in the workplace. They are highly trained, highly skilled, but that golden thread of value has to run throughout. And I think there's a real sense of we're trying to do the very best. We don't always get it right. We don't always meet expectations. But we've even seen through our staff survey, we really do believe in what we're doing, and I think that's collective across the organisation, and we have a desire to do better.
Yes, indeed. Going really to Jenny now, in terms of, am I right? This is the first time the Lord Advocate's guidelines have been published. Am I correct? So that's the first time. And because we have such a different system operating in Scotland from England, is there any equivalent about guidelines being given, or maybe like Gabrielle can answer that question? I'm just interested to reinforce that point. This is a little bit of a breakthrough in my view in transparency and openness, which you made quite a lot of, and I think it's important. Tell me what I'm...
You're right. The first time it's been published, content has been discussed at various points. For example, in November, extended all classes of drugs. And in terms of the English experience, I'm aware guidance is out there. So I'm an expert in it, I've looked at it. Senior team maybe to talk about experience better. I know it's out there.
She may have some comparative information for us.
As I had mentioned in my presentation, the best policing is that which takes place with the agreement of the public. But in terms of the guidelines themselves, I couldn't see in England and Wales an exact match as such. You know, guidelines and similar kinds of commentary exist. Perhaps others can elaborate. But I certainly couldn't see a document of this precise kind in
We're coming to the end. I did mention I'd like to just a conversation. Maybe you can't engage in this, but one of the clear categories excluded is hate crime. If Jenny can start off by saying, is there something you can tell us about the rationale for that? Because this is one of those contested areas, like at the mall, where in public policy discussions, it sometimes feels that police lean in too hard on some forms of online hate crime, for example. So the logic of excluding it, a little bit from you about that, if you could.
It's reflective of it being a priority in terms of policy, but it's also reflective of the nuances involved with hate crime and difficulties in making those decisions that at this stage anyway still sit with the parents to make those decisions around what to do with hate crime. And I would emphasise again, this isn't a binary approach. This isn't a case of police direct measures for prosecution. There is a range of activity and outcomes that prosecutors can put in place to deal with all offences.
If a police officer thinks that hate crime has been committed, they are required to pass it through for prosecution, and you will make the decision because it's for you at the moment to make that decision within the Crown Office.
They are not on the list of eligible offences in terms of the fixed element of direct measures. So yes, subject to the insufficiency and subject to what we also discussed, which is that innate ability of the police to issue verbal warnings, to take those kinds of actions that are deliberately not restricted by the guidelines that
Thank you. I'm going to come to Pat, who couldn't do a presentation. Anything to add from your perspective as a professional police officer in this general area?
Thanks, Chair. I think the question you asked about how well it's been received for operational officers is a really important question. So what we have with the digital handheld devices that we now basically use as digital notebooks is that because of technology and the use of technology, and Jenny's touched on some of the additional work that's ongoing across desk and some of the case management, all reducing the journey time scales for victims, offenders and witnesses is really important. But the ability for us to automate and the time it saves officers on the street to basically thereafter move on to a further incident is that they simply can issue the recorded police warning or fixed penalty notice on their device, and that automatically thereafter updates our crime system, and thereafter basically refers it through to the criminal history system, and again that whole process is now automated, so there's no need for double or triple being a Paul, that whole process is extremely fluid now, so it's that greater use of technology across the board. So again, really well received by operational officers at this stage.
That automation on the handheld devices, will that try to minimise or absolutely rule out the wrong data inputting? Because I think that's been one of the issues in the past. If you could talk about that a little bit.
So even the crime side, so Jenny touched on some of the exclusions and about case of abuse and every sexual crime. There is no opportunity to basically issue a fixed penalty notice or a recorded police warning for those type of offences, because it is almost greyed out on the actual handheld device. So there's so many safeguards built into the process, as well as the audit process on a weekly basis that we carry out internally, and that ongoing review process as well. So again, the safeguards around about the inappropriate use of it are really clear and built into the technology aspect of it.
The internal review process, so you're not able to offer a recorded police warning in certain types of crime, that you can't do that, it's greyed out. But internally they are reviewed, I understand. Can you talk a little bit about that, at what level they were reviewed and what proportion are reviewed?
We review all direct measures on a Monday every week through our criminal justice division. So again, we've got resources in place to basically monitor the numbers that are coming through. And again, what we do is that we monitor what the direct measure has been issued for. If there is any concern that it's been issued and appropriate, we'll get thereafter again and basically review that. But there is a dip sample process that we are actually looking at, and we are doing on a weekly basis just now, which is thereafter building in, as I say, the additional safeguards around it, which is extremely positive what we have in place.
I'll ask you all the same question, and you may or may not be able to answer it. It's around about what Gemma was talking about, public confidence, and we all touched on this. And there is a view, and I think it was in the tripartite inspection review, that public confidence in some of these aspects is lower than we might like. People don't feel it's the right way to deal with criminal behaviour. So coming to you, and I'll cover on the table, is there something that you can, a suggestion or an action that you could make which may go towards increasing public confidence in direct measures? And the reason I ask that is I don't think they're in policy doubt. We're not arguing about whether this policy should be implemented or not. It's very clearly embedded. It's part of the strategy of the government. It's clearly been delivered by Police Scotland. So the issue for me is increased public confidence in direct measures. So
Probably I've already answered this, but I suppose my final point on that would be that a measure of public confidence, but not a measure of public understanding. So we've looked at public confidence in something, a particular measure, but we haven't measured potentially how well they really understand what that is and what it can do. Or we have done from the perspective of it being issued in one area, but not the so what, the thereafter, the benefits, the understanding of that, I suppose everything that we've already touched on in this presentation is about, in that bigger sense, what does it give people? What is it about? If we also think that people would like earlier resolution, a huge focus just now around the Vision for Justice is obviously improved journey times to give victims and witnesses the ability to experience that justice that they need if they want to in a quicker way. So if those things are desirable, we need to make sure that people fully understand the measures that we're putting in, why they contribute to things like that. Otherwise, they're almost abstract. They become abstract to those desires and those aims in the broader system. And I think doing that is achieved through ensuring that we've got a much more shared understanding across all organisations of what they are, and that we're communicating not just that we're doing something, but actually the more completeness around what that is.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of public confidence, I would support regular public events of this kind, pitched at the public and inviting public participation. It seems to me that the question of what the police are for and why they matter requires constant attention, constant reflection, and keeping that question in play and subject to public discussion is essential, both to the effectiveness and the legitimacy of policing, and I think more broadly to the quality of democratic life. Academic research, of course, has a role to play, but it needs to be endorsed by the police themselves, who have that deep knowledge of what is going on the ground.
In terms of concrete things or actions that we can discuss, what we are able to publish out of the ongoing review, and I think that it may be helpful, because that we just sort of don't really do that, is providing stories, providing examples, bringing it to life so that people understand how and when it's used and in what kind of circumstances in a really tangible way. So I think, and this panel has been so useful in reflecting on how we can really improve that engagement with the public and the best ways that we can increase that, enhance that understanding as well as the awareness of the next thing.
Pat, then Wendy.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think probably not repeating what's already been said, but I think even the Lord Advocate's guidelines being in the public domain, sets that standard up initially. The fact is that they're transparent, they're there to be reviewed and criticised around that. I think the aspect of Gabrielle around academic research, I think that would help greatly as well. And we spoke just, we were off the table there just about how we can basically try to link in and perhaps resource and fund that as well. I think Gabrielle had mentioned the point then about consistency of approach, and I think that's one of the things that's always been in the back of my mind around that threshold. How can we ensure through audit that basically we have that consistent approach, how we manage and deal with direct measures. And I think when about, we have obviously through the guidelines agreed with COPFS that we will carry out an annual review as well, which will go through to the Chief Constable and to the Lord Advocate. So again, when about, is there a possibility we can put that in the public domain? I think the final thing I was just going to add was that some of the coverage within the public domain, perhaps when about some of the TV programmes that have been on, such as Highland Cops, where there was the issuing of a direct measure within an incident that the officer was dealing with. Again, put that right in the public domain around about how we can deal with some low-level offending as such. So I think all those areas are all probably going to enhance public confidence in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I would echo really, I suppose, what Jenny and Pat have said. We know from academic research the drivers of public confidence also include providing information to the public and meaningful information. So I suppose from my perspective, I'd like to share publicly what I know and what information I have access to. There's also something for me about, and Gemma has really kind of alluded to it, in terms of the importance of community policing and the community policing model across Scotland, because there's something for me about really understanding community sentiment, about who are most vulnerable in society, and what are the appropriate measures that we can put in place with partners to better support those people. So I think from my perspective, those would be the two aspects that I think would really support the transformation picture in justice in Scotland.
So thank you very much to all the panel members for your giving up your morning to come and have this conversation here. And thank you everybody who might have been watching, and we will, as I say, clean up the audio for the first half and let you hear it if you'd like to hear it in a clear way. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have this type of event. I would say myself, we've all mentioned it, the key to public confidence in this area is firstly openness. I'm very, very pleased that the guidelines were published. I think I'm very pleased that you're able as police officers to give us a clear account of what you are training officers to do, and an awareness of those issues of boundary we've talked about where it's unclear. Pat Campbell mentioned the review taking place, I think, every Monday of every single direct measure. And then the Crown Office is also saying, well, maybe you're going to learn more to actually have more confidence to issue these in order that the Crown can actually focus on the more very serious crimes. The second point, I think, is a research point, and I don't mean just academic research. I mean a genuinely joint research, which is the evidence of effectiveness. We need to know and be able to persuade people these are effective deterrents. These are seen as real sanctions for people, and they raise community and individual and family confidence in the justice system. And I think the final one really on this, where you have discretion, and it is critical to say, without discretion we wouldn't have the policing we have. I think it's fundamental to the British and Scottish model of policing. We need an assessment of fairness. If disproportionality exists in the system, we need to be able to find how that is, because every time discretion is offered, and I would say, like Pat, watch Highland Cops, you'll see the compassionate application of a direct measure in Highland Cops. But it also means that sometimes it will be inconsistent. It's bound to be inconsistent, which is the price we pay for that which we require as a society, the proper exercise of police officer discretion. So I think an assessment of fairness and how it impacts, I think, particularly on some of our more vulnerable communities. So once again, thank you everybody for being online, and thank you to our panel, and I look forward to the next event that we have. Thank you very much.